Welcome to the Plant Initiatives podcast series, where we talk with people about the innovative work they're doing to increase the respectful treatment of plants and to advance an effective plant advocacy movement through encouraging policy, law, and activism on behalf of plants. My name is Sue Fager. I'm a board member on the Plant Initiative. And today I'm excited to be talking with Joan Maloof, Professor Emeritus, author, and founder of the OldGrowth Forest Network. Joan is also the recipient of a grant from the Plant Initiative. Joan, welcome to the podcast. Such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you, Sue. Honored to be asked.
Tell us a little bit about the OldGrowth Forest Network and your work there.
The OldGrowth Forest Network really started in 2007. I was writing a book about the old growth forests in the eastern United States, and I was traveling all around from one little bit of old growth forest to another. And suddenly I realized how precious and rare these eastern old growth forests were, and that we were down to 1%. And I didn't know of any organization that was specifically focused on preserving that last 1% so that they didn't just disappear. And I realized that there needed to be a group focused on that. And in addition to preserving that tiny 1% that was left, I felt we also needed to let more of our forests recover and become old growth once again. So the mission would be not only to preserve what's left, but also to protect some forests that they could become old growth in the future. And in my mind, we could do that by setting aside one forest in each county of the US that would not be cut again and would be open to the public so people could see these places and love them, connect with them. And it just all came to me at once, and it would be called the Old Growth Forest Network. And no matter where you lived or where you went, there would be a protected forest nearby, and school children would have one in their county. And the idea, as I said, was 2007, but then it took me a few years to actually put it into implementation. So in 2011, I left my teaching job at the university to actually get the Old Growth Forest Network started, to build a board, to get supporters, to start putting the first forests into the network. So we've been really growing these past more than 10 years now, and we have a small staff, and we have over 200 forests in this network that was just a vision back in 2007, and many people and organizations that support us, such as the Plant Initiative.
Oh, Joan, that is awesome. Are most of those forests on the East Coast? Have they moved west?
We have forests all over the US, including Alaska and Hawaii, and we have many in California, and we are now in 35 different states. So it started out being mostly in the East because that's where I live. Mm-hmm. And and my books were mostly about the Eastern forests at first, so people were sort of primed to create this network there. But since then, we've had great success in other states. Right now, Pennsylvania and Ohio are kind of tied for the lead in which state has the most forests in the network. And they're kind of a little competition with each other. Each of them wants to be first. So every time we add one in, let's say, Pennsylvania, then Ohio says, okay, now we need to add some more counties. That's a good thing.
That's really interesting, Joan, because when I think about Ohio, old growth forests or forests in general, it's really not anything that pops into my mind. I think of it, I guess, as industrial and farmland.
Yes, it's amazing when you travel through Ohio on the highways, it's just feels so flat in most places, and it feels like the forest is all gone. Whereas if you look at the old maps, Ohio was 95% covered in forest. Well, what happened there, I think, as Ohio got cleared for agriculture on these large farms, they would always leave a certain area that was the woodlot. So if they needed to build a new barn or they needed to put in a fence, they would have the wood for that. So the whole industrial forest management field never really got to Ohio because it was already so cleared by the time the industry started. So what we have now are these woodlots that belong to families, were taken care of for generations and protected. Now many of them have been converted to state natural areas. So the state is making sure that these last woodlots remain. And so I've just been amazed at how beautiful some of those Ohio forests are, and covered with wildflowers in the spring too. So if anyone wants to visit any of these Ohio forests, just look at our website, oldgrowthforest.net, look under Ohio, and you get exact directions to these forests and can visit any of them.
That's a great resource, Joan, because I'm thinking about, what about Minnesota?
Exactly. And we have forests that are going into Minnesota in the network too, like the Lost 40 and Itasca. Those are some famous ones we're looking at putting in the network that aren't in yet. But many people have been telling us that they've been using our website as a resource when they plan travel across the country, or even just visiting relatives for Thanksgiving that are a number of states away. It's like, hey, let's visit one of these old forests either on the way or when we get there, and bring the family.
Because how, sorry, I keep interrupting you. How else would people know where they are without your website?
Exactly, that was the point. There was no way to even look that up. There was no good resource. The first even estimates we had of how much old growth forest was left in the East was not until 1992. And it was Mary Bird Davis that did a survey, and she called all these different people and all these state offices, and she put together estimates. But some of those forests were on private land. They're not open to the public. There were no directions for how to get there. So we, by making it very important that not only these forests are preserved, but they're appreciated by people that can visit them, that's very important to us, because we feel like that's one way to keep these forests protected for the future, is by always having a generation that's in love with them.
Right. I was just going to say that. How else do you fall in love with a forest unless you visit it and you see it and you feel it and you hear it?
It's so true. And so many of the talks I give, I'll talk to the audience about where they've been or how they grew up. And a lot of them, as children, were taken to an old growth forest like Cook Forest in Pennsylvania. And now they have a lifelong love for these places. And now they're coming to my talks, and then they're donating to organizations such as ours. So it's just something we have to keep going.
Yes. So a small group of committed people really can change the world.
It can, no doubt.
I think this would be a really great time, Joan, to define what is an old growth forest, or what is meant by an old growth forest. And to prepare for our podcast, I did a little poking around online, and I found a definition that personally I really liked from the Food and Agricultural Organization affiliated with the UN. And they said, an old growth forest is one that is naturally regenerated forest of native species, where there are no clearly visible indications of human activities, and the ecological processes are not significantly disturbed. Are there other names for old growth forests, do you think? Or other ways of thinking about old growth forests?
So as in terms of names, back 100 years ago, we might call them virgin forests. That phrase is kind of unpopular now. It's
Yes.
patriarchal. So old growth is more commonly used, but in other places they use the term primary forest, which is the same thing, or ancient forest. But really, when you think about these forests, if we think about the Earth as a whole, every place on planet Earth has a sort of ecological trajectory that it's moving toward. And its own ecological trajectory depends on the temperature in that area, and the rainfall in that area, and the wind patterns in that area, and the forest fire patterns in the area. So if you put all those things together, certain places are going to be forests if you leave them alone. And those forests are going to have complex structures. They'll have young trees, middle-aged trees, old trees. They'll have trees that are dying, trees that are coming up. They'll have all the animals that live in that associated habitat. So to me, that's an old growth forest. One of these places on Earth that's just been left alone to do its own thing. And we can, that's not really a scientific definition. There really isn't one, but to me, that's a good way of looking at it. One of these places that we've left alone to do its own thing.
A holistic perspective.
Yes. Yeah. So it was very interesting the last year, because in not this past April, the one before, President Biden came out with an executive order, and he said he wanted the Forest Service and BLM to define old growth and to figure out how much of it was left on federal lands. And it's amazing to think that there hadn't been an agreed upon definition. And so this was quite challenging for the Forest Service and BLM. And they came up with different definitions depending on the region of the forest. So you can imagine that the definition of an old growth redwood or sequoia forest would be much different than an old growth, maybe loblolly pine forest. So the definitions can vary depending on where you are and the age that the forests have to be before you consider them old growth.
Okay. As someone who loves trees, I'm intrigued by other people's journey to their relationship with trees. Could you share how you came to this work?
I don't know how I came to this work.
How'd you fall in love with trees, Joan? I'm making an assumption that you love them.
I do love trees. I think I was born with an affinity for plants. So that's the part that I don't know really how that happened. If you believe in past lives and reincarnation, maybe that's part of it, or it maybe could be just the earth produces what it needs at a certain time. But from the time that I was a toddler, I can remember just being fascinated with the plants, and it started with just the little clovers in the yard or the dandelions, but I just remember looking at them and being amazed. And even the shrubs, all of a sudden, these buds are bursting into bloom. It's just a miracle to me. And then as I got older, of course, I climbed trees a lot, and I loved being up high in the trees. And I'd bring a book with me lots of times, and I'd just sit way up in the tree and read a book. And I know a lot of other forest lovers started by climbing trees too. So I have a grandson now. I encourage him to climb trees. But then when it came to knowing trees more as a scientist or more academically, then when I started university, I was amazed to learn that you could study trees that way. And so I did. And part of me, I was always wondering, when you see a tree in the landscape, why does this particular branch grow in this particular spot and spread in this particular way and have these particular things on it? And every tree looks different to me, just like every human, they're individuals. And so I thought by studying plants that I would learn the answers to that. Well, what I've learned is we don't really have the answers to that, that these are unique individuals as we are. Certain things, light makes a difference and genetics makes a difference, but overall, we don't have those answers. So I studied plants in every way I could. At first that started out with horticulture and landscape design and plant pathology. And then I learned to identify native wild plants. And finally, I got into ecology and studied plant-animal interactions. And that's really when I began to become an advocate for the forest ecosystem, because I could see how many other living creatures depended on the structure and the protection that the trees offered them. And so that became the whole ecological view of wanting to protect forests and the trees that make them up.
That's a great journey story, Joan. Thanks for sharing it. The Plant Initiative is working to increase the respectful treatment of plants. What does respect for plants mean to you?
To me, respect for plants means that they're not just things for humans to use. So yes, we get wood fiber from trees, and that's wonderful. And we get paper fiber from trees, but that's not why these things exist. And so while we do use the wood from trees for some of those things, just like some of us use some animals for food, or we pull vegetables out of the ground for food, we need to recognize that they are also worthy of, that they're alive, and that they should be treated with respect, and that there should be at least some places where they can be free and wild. Maybe not everywhere, but also respect for plants is, lately we've been talking about bringing more diversity into our human organizations and ecosystems, but I also feel the same way about plants, that their diversity should be allowed to shine as well. So how that would look on the ground is, instead of like having a perfect lawn with a few trees planted in it and say, oh, I love plants, look, there's my lawn and there's my trees. What about having a place where whatever plants show up can just show up and live, even if they're labeled by some people as a weed, to just learn to appreciate those plants as well. And what you'll find is that they're attracting pollinators, and certain animals, caterpillars or rabbits, whatever they are, will eat them. And it can just be so interesting to open yourself to that world, to more and more plant species.
Yes, I see that in my own backyard, Joan. There's a little city pocket park. And prior to COVID, the city mowed everything right up to people's property lines. And then I guess they decided with COVID, they weren't going to take the person hours to do it. And so they just left it alone. And so it has been so much fun to see what happens with that space. And a neighbor and I keep adding native plants from our own gardens in there, but just to see all the critters the fireflies at night. I'm surprised at the density of them in such a small space, and so many butterflies and dragonflies. And I just sit out there with my cats and I'm like, this is so amazing. It's so beautiful.
Yes, and it's free.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a lot of work. That's one of the best things that you can do, is just expand the wild plant area and not mow so far. And it can be something you could move out a foot a year in your, if you have a big yard and you're just make a lot of big changes, just allow more and more. And you'll see also that it's not just the what we would call weeds or the wildflowers coming in, but young trees will come into those spaces too. And so many times I'll see, well, for instance, there's a forest in Maryland where, yay, we saved the forest. And not only that, but they were going to take the cornfield and they were going to expand the forest. But instead, they could have just let that field go because there's a forest right next door. There's seed source. The animals are carrying seeds. But instead, they felt like they had to plant new trees in rows. And I think that's a mistake because they're not going to have the same genetic makeup as the native trees that are nearby, or even the species makeup. So I think it came from a good place, wanting to expand the forest. We don't often realize how much nature can do on her own.
Yeah, that is so true, Joan. Totally agree with you. So you've written several books. Can you tell us about your latest book, a revised and expanded edition of Nature's Temples, The Natural History of Old Growth Forests?
Thank you for asking about my book. I'm very excited about this book because I really wrote it for the forest activists, for the people that are speaking out for the forest and trying to save them. Now, that's not a huge population, unfortunately. So as I was writing it, I also knew, well, this is not going to be on the New York Times bestseller, and it's not going to make me rich because there's just a small group of people that are probably going to be interested in it. But I really wanted to provide something useful to those wonderful people speaking out for the forest, because so often in the front of the room, there'll be somebody, maybe a county forester, who is saying, oh, that forest needs to be managed, or it needs to be thinned, or it needs to be cut, and this, or the trees are all going to die, or the insects are going to take over, all these scare tactics. And as a scientist, I knew that there was a lot of scientific evidence showing that that was not true. And in fact, when you thin these forests and cut these forests and manage these forests, what really ends up happening is we lose diversity of all kinds in the forest. So not only diversity of tree species and wildflower species, but we lose diversity of the fungi kingdom and the moss kingdom and the salamanders. And I wanted to give that evidence to these activists and spell it out. So I have chapters on all those things, showing the scientific evidence that the unmanaged, left alone forests are healthier in every way, including the largest trees and the oldest trees and the most biodiverse habitat. So when I wrote the original version of it in 2016, and I was happy that that was published. But now I feel like its time has really come, you know, especially with this federal attention now to old forests. I think that even a lot of the forest managers are starting to open up and realize that this is something that they should be educated on.
Excellent. So that just flows right into my next question about the grant, the small grant that the Plan Initiative provided to the Old Growth Forest Network to help you send your new book to leaders in university forestry departments throughout the country. you've kind of answered the question, but I just wanted to see if you wanted to add anything else to why did you want to send the book to forestry schools that are known for training people to cut forests?
Yeah, I would love to dive into that. And thank you so much for that grant. So this is something that we had been discussing for a while. When, let's say, a municipality or a county or the state or even a private person that owns a forest was thinking, well, I want to be a responsible steward for this forest. What should I do for this forest? I don't really understand forests. And it could be the mayor or it could be a private person, and they would call a certified forester. And the forester would come in, and so many times we saw them giving advice for cutting the forest. One example was in my first book, Teaching the Trees, where I visited this beautiful beech forest, big beech trees and wild plants like beech drops and kinds of birds in the forest. And the next time I came through, it was cut down. And the reason was because the forester had advised them to cut the beech trees that really weren't worth that much in the market and put in pine trees, because the pine trees would then be ready for cutting in 30 years and they'd make more money by doing that. And the people that listened to the forester's advice thought they were doing the right thing. And so we saw this happening over and over again. The foresters saying to cut, and the plant people like myself were saying, no, don't cut. It's healthy and beautiful and perfect just the way it is. And it was strange because you would think that the forestry people would be the most educated on this, and they are, but only in terms of the economics.
Right,
So,
the resource use.
Yes, exactly. And so we thought we needed to reach people in these forestry schools. People go to forestry schools because they love forests, but then they're almost brainwashed by the time they get out. So we wanted to reach the schools, and we thought, well, maybe there would be like an ecology teacher that could introduce the old growth forests and why they're so important to these students. And we've been talking about this for a while. And then when the opportunity came up for a grant with Plant Initiative, we knew exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to send one of my new books to each of the schools in hopes that this simpatico professor may want to have the students read it, and we could change the system from within.
It'll be exciting to see what happens. I know you just sent the book, so maybe in a year's time, we'll have a sense of how the books is being received and how professors might be using it.
Yes, yes. And yeah, I'm excited about that. I think there's going to be a change. And even in our small organization, one of our staff members, our network manager, he went to forestry school and he was trained as a forester. So he knows all that lingo. And so, you know, we love foresters too. We just want them to be more educated on this. And then he started working for a land trust, so he could see how they were more gently protecting and managing their forest. And then he came to work for us. And now he's really got it. His name is Nick Sanchez. And so he understands both sides of the equation, so he can help to educate the other foresters as well.
Yeah, that's nice. That's really nice. In your experience, can a logged old growth forest recover? And what factors contribute to the success of that?
So humans have been using forests for a long time, you know, in North America. You know, we've had native peoples here for 15,000 years, and they've certainly used wood, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think in situations where a place was selectively logged and gently logged, maybe using animal power to get the logs out, I think it can recover over time. You know, if you give it probably 250 years, you'd never even know that somebody was in there taking out. But these days, if you use some of the industrial methods like clear cutting, using big equipment, we have never seen a forest fully recover from that. Now, it may be in 1,000 years they could, but we haven't been around that long since that kind of logging is happening. And from what we see so far with that industrial forest management, as I said, they never fully recover their full biodiversity of snails or fungi or wildflowers. And times have also changed in that we have a lot more invasive plant species now, and we have a lot more deer that are eating the plants. So if you logged a forest 80 years ago, it might come back as a native forest without a lot of invasives. But if you do that same logging now, you could have a whole different situation on your hands. And that's another huge reason that we advise against these large clearings.
What advice do you have for people who want to create change in their own communities in terms of increasing respect for plants?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's things, Sue, that you can do in your personal life. Of course, just paying attention to the plants, making them part of your day, even smelling the leaves, even tasting them, learning the species names really help, whether it's trees or some of the wild plants. But beyond that, also not being afraid to talk to other people about their relationship with plants and to sort of build a simpatico community of other people that love plants in your area. And this can be really useful in case there's threats to, let's say, a forest nearby, then you know who your friends are going to be that will help you. And it can also be useful politically. There's a lot of things you can do in a community to help preserve trees, such as tree ordinances that would prevent the largest trees from being cut in your community, or forming an open space commission that would help to protect some of the wild forests around your community. So I think that's the best way to build appreciation for plants. Do it together.
Community level change.
So important. Also, another thing, instead of assuming that other people will do it, don't be afraid to take a leadership role. One of the things I suggest is looking around in your community and trying to understand what is the oldest wild forest near your home. And then beyond that, who owns it? So you start paying attention. What about that forest? What about that forest? What about that forest? And then finally you'll recognize, oh, this is a really beautiful forest. I would hate to come around the corner one year and see that that one's cut down. Well, it might be if you don't start asking questions, who owns it and how it's being managed. So you may find out that it's a publicly owned forest, and that's great because it belongs to you and you have some input in how it's managed when you get on those lists. But it could also be a privately owned forest, and maybe the owners have no idea that what they have is special. Or maybe they do, and if they do, you can celebrate that, and you can maybe help them to get it preserved by putting an easement on it, or eventually when they pass, having it donated, like to a state natural area or something. Or, if you just by offering that if they ever were going to manage it, to have them talk to you, because otherwise they could get one of those foresters that say, oh, cut it all down and start over with pine or something. And then you always be sorry that you never stepped up and offered to assist with that.
Yes, I think that's true. And for people who are listening and who think, oh, I don't know if I could call my city, county forestry department, and are they going to be nice to me? What's that interaction going to look like? I'm on a first name basis with the city's forester. I call him up all the time, and he is so kind, and he is so willing to meet me where I am, almost where I am. I don't think he can quite go all the way to sentience, but yeah, so I would just encourage people to reach out and have a conversation and express your thoughts and feelings and concern about the trees that are on public land, if that's what you have closest to you. I think those city and county state workers, I think they want to hear from citizens of the community, because it's important to them, because that's where the forests are in the community.
Yes, and sometimes they want to save particular trees, but it's their voice against their bosses. Yeah. The other politicians or the people that are afraid, oh, if that tree falls down, it's going to hurt some people. So they feel like they have to remove the trees perhaps to save their jobs. But if they felt like there was a community of people who also love those trees behind them, it would make their job much easier.
Yeah. Joan, I have asked you all of the questions I was going to. Do you have any last thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I would say that we have a special place in this job of preserving plants as humans, because as humans, we have done the most damage to the forested ecosystem. The forest cover on the planet has gone from 46% to 31%, and that's all because of humans and what we've done and our technology and our development, and in some cases our greed. And so I think that also gives us a special responsibility to speak out for the plant people that can't speak for themselves. So often I'm in situations where it's myself and other activists, and we're saying, no, don't cut this forest, leave it. And then there's other people, maybe they're foresters, maybe they're politicians, whoever is saying, oh no, we need to cut this forest. We need to use it for a resource. We need to do this. And I keep thinking, well, what about the plants themselves, the trees themselves? They should have a say in the.
They should have a voice.
Do, right? But they, of course, don't. So we can also try to be the voice for them. And so when I get up, making one of these statements in front of these rooms, I will usually list the trees that are at threat of that we're talking about. I'll bring them into the room, the hollies, the maples, the sweet gums, the black gums, the white oaks, already to remind people that that's who we're talking about. We're making decisions for them, and we have a responsibility for that.
Make it real and make it personal, Jill.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Joan, again, thank you so much for joining us and helping us to better understand the importance of old growth forests and inspiring listeners to get involved with experiencing and protecting their community's forests. If listeners want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
The best place is our website, oldgrowthforest.net. And not only will you find out where all these forests are, 200 of them that you can visit now, some of them old growth, some of them getting to old growth, but you can also, if you sign up for our list, when we do a forest dedication in your state, we will let you know, you'll be invited, you can hike through the forest with us. If you want to help us find the forest for your area that would be best, we take nominations for forests. We have volunteers that are looking for the forests in their county, and that's how we get our work done. So connect with us through the website, oldgrowthforest.net. And Sue, I also want to thank you for your work with the Plant Initiative. It's very inspiring. And I think you're the future, for us to understand that these plants are beings and they respect, and we're going to have to change how we've dealt with them in the past. So
it'll take a community, Joan. all of us getting involved.
Yep.
So thank you again. And for listeners, just a reminder, you can find our podcasts on our website at plantinitiative.org. And thank you, Joan.
Thanks.